You just did it when you described what you believed a conservative was. I mean, you were like, here's my definition of what conservatives are. You just did the exact thing you said that you didn't want done with Civil War. And I actually respect your opinion, but you to do the generalizations that you just did
No.
about all conservatives,
Did I ever say all
congratulations, you just
conservatives?
made my argument. Thank you.
No, I said that there's an association.
All right, welcome back, everyone. This is I Didn't Read Your Book. I am your host, Lutch, and today we are not doing a podcast, but in fact, we are doing another edition of IDRYB Live.
It's true. We live in the information age. We create exabytes of data at any given point. It's impossible to expect a person to be able to sift through all of that and come to an understanding of the world. That is true. In which case, even the few sources that a person listens to, you should at least try to put in the effort to make sure that they're valid sources. Unfortunately, pundits, by their very nature, have a incentive to not be valid because good information is not sexy. It's not entertaining. It's not fun. It's very confusing, and it takes a lot of mental effort to do that. People who sensationalize don't necessarily have the incentive to be accurate, which is why, for the most part, if people gain a lot of following for telling something, it's probably an incentive to not trust them. I think you would understand if you look at some products that are marketed very well, but are actually very poorly made. A lot of the money went into the marketing so that you're kind of stuck with a mediocre product. Likewise, it's the same thing with pundits. In the world where we're going to have limited understanding of our information, I think it should be one, look to people who are very responsible in the claims that they make. So if you make a fantastical claim, like, oh my God, we're going to have a civil war, you're going to need a shit ton of evidence, a fantastical amount of evidence to support that claim. If someone throws around hyperbole that easily, then they're not very responsible with their words. If you don't understand a topic, then don't make positive claims on it.
Okay, but real quick. So, talking about sensationalism and the idea of punditry being entertainment, I would argue that is all of the more reason that you are able to read into the whatever biases are being displayed. If somebody's talking, then you have facial expressions, body language, tone of voice, all of that kind of stuff. If you're just
reading, they're very good actors.
If they're very good actors, then they're very good actors, and I mean, you've got to but a good actor can't predict the future based on reading the news and seeing what's going to happen and understanding culture well enough to predict what's going to happen. And
I don't know where you see that. Like, Tim Pool predicted that all 50 states would go to Trump. That didn't happen. I don't know, like, what accuracy you're looking from these clowns.
I mean, perfect segue is the Civil War that we are in right now. You are someone who claims that he is crazy for saying this. Meanwhile, a whole swath of the country on both sides of the aisle believe that it is happening right now. And when you are shown examples of it, then you just decide that they don't count, or they're cherry picked, or they're just individual examples. And so the question becomes, if you have your mind made up about something, what good is evidence to the contrary if you're not willing to accept it?
We all live in the realities we are most comfortable with. Okay. And that's part of human nature, to be honest with you, is if that's your comfort area, etc., you're going to accept the data and facts in that particular realm. That's just the nature of being a human being.
For sure. But I mean, again, Blaine, I think in our IDRYB conversation, we had talked about the Civil War, and what are your thoughts on I guess specifically if you're familiar, but more generally if you're not, specifically Tim's claims about what the Civil War is and the fourth and fifth generational warfare, things like that.
I haven't actually gone through Tim's speeches or pontifications on Civil War. My own opinion is there is a conflict being waged right now. If we want to call it a civil war, we can. I think it's a most uncivil war more than anything.
Well, same with the Civil War,
and
right?
it's a war of cultures, and it's a war of ideals, and it's a war of clashes. We have groups of people that are more than willing to try to delist authors, to remove people from having a voice because they don't agree with where they're at politically. Which to me I've never seen in our society up until this point. We've always had sensational journalism. I mean, you look up yellow journalism,
Right.
going back to the Spanish-American War, journalists have always been all over the place, but you're seeing more and more people kind of push it. I've talked to two people, both of which have written books recently that are both going, secession is actually viable in like New Hampshire, or Texas has actually got a Texit movement that's very active where they're going, maybe we shouldn't just be part of the United States anymore. Maybe we should go back to being a republic. And they make tons, I'll be honest with you. The data that was presented, very convincing, very solid data, but that doesn't, to me fundamentally, it's one of those things I struggle with because I'm like, it's not something I would encourage. It's not something I want to happen. So I feel we're in the days kind of like we were doing with prior to 9/11. There was a war being waged against the United States by fundamental Islamic, crazies against the United States. They were attacking embassies. They were tried to bomb the World Trade Center, in the garage, etc. It took 9/11 for us to realize that the war was actually happening, but it had been going on for a long time. And by the way, I'm not saying that's all just one way. There's definitely actions that we
Oh,
took
sure.
to sponsor some of that activity. I'm not crazy, but I feel like we're in that stage right now. And I heard somebody say, yeah, well, what happened at the Capitol was a tipping point. And I said, we haven't hit the tipping point because nothing changed after what happened in the Capitol. That didn't alter anything. We're not at the tipping point. I don't know where that is, but I kind of feel like there's a conflict that's being waged in the background, and we're seeing it on every level, be it vaccinations, be it, social media, be it how big tech reacts to things. Yeah, there's a conflict that's going on, and it's going to take something to get people to fully realize the full depth and scope of it.
Yeah,
That's my take on it.
and that's actually something that Tim talks about all the time in the formation of how a war happens. When we learn about it in school, you learn this event and then that event and then that event and that event, as if everybody was aware of everything else that was going on. And going back to Tim's early days, there was when he was in, I think it was Sweden. There would be clashes of just small groups, and then you'd go 2 blocks down and there's people sitting in a cafe having no idea what's going on. And so again, if you just hear civil war and you think Tim is saying, oh, there's a civil war because there was some riots that got out of hand, and then some people got into the Capitol, yeah, that would be a super extreme statement. However, if you actually look into what he is saying, he's saying that much like the wars of the past, they don't just happen in succession. There's often months and months in between events, and even the events themselves don't necessarily fit into a narrative, so to speak, of this is war, we are at war, until it's over. And as you were just saying with 9/11, it took 9/11 to realize that we had been at war in the Middle East for decades. And not that, or I guess not that we had been at war, but that they were at war specifically with us. It would be more accurate to say.
Okay,
And
I have to step in because I feel like the definition of what a war is completely lost in this conversation. I guess maybe it's just me and my perspective. I don't view like Twitter mobs as like an act of war or some sort of consolidation towards groups of people like trying to topple the government and create some sort of new government or regime. A civil war is a very like specific phenomenon where there are organizations that try to use political violence to capture government resources and to take control of the government. Or it's like some sort of secession movement like we had in the American Civil War. Those phenomena just don't exist because it's almost like economically impossible for those phenomena to exist.
As a military historian, I mean, I've written numerous books on military history, and I understand exactly where you're coming from. I try not to parse things down to a solid definition because what I found is people argue about the definition rather than what's actually happening. And if people feel that there's a conflict going on, then that conflict does exist, whether you want to define it as a civil war or whether we call it something else. There is a conflict within the nation right now. And I think actually it's not just the
Right.
United States. I would say I've seen a lot of evidence in France and other countries in Europe where they're struggling as well internally with much of what's unfolding here. I mean, what I saw last year during the riots, where we saw Antifa going in and burning and looting and corrupting what would be normally peaceful protests and turning it into something else. I see the violence there, and there's not a lot of difference between what I experienced there and what I experienced when the Vietnam protests were going on and some of those got out of hand, or the civil rights some of the more violent civil rights activism that took place.
Did those
Yeah.
ever reach the threshold of what you would consider a civil war?
So again, I think this is sorry. I think this is
It's a good
precisely his
question.
point.
I don't actually have something that I can throw to that. No.
And I think, but that speaks directly to his point, Anirudh, is that you're getting caught up on the wording and the fact when you hear Civil War, you think of the American Civil War, brother fighting against brother in the
I think of
streets.
Syria.
Okay, whatever it is that you think of, you are now, the way that language works is colloquially, and when we speak of this conflict, whether you want to call it a war or not is again, up to move is semantics. But the point that you seem to be brushing aside is that there is conflict, and just calling it
Twitter
that
there's
beef
not
and
there's not like polarization, there's political conflict, there's strife. I don't disagree with that, but to call that a civil war, I just
so sorry to interrupt your podcast experience. I just want to remind you, if you're enjoying what you're watching, please hit the like button and subscribe for more content. And if you really love it, there's some support links in the description. I would love if you could help out the channel. And back to the show. Okay, fine. So let's call it a very
uncivil disagreement. Let's go.
Sure.
It doesn't matter, because I think
how does that make things any better to call it
because I think, for one, framing something as be like a civil war actively sends the message that this is not something that we can fix, and I think that's counterproductive to any ability to actually fix this. I don't want to this is an issue that we see a lot with conservatives, because one of the personality traits that defines conservatism is an increased response to fear of outsiders, fear of immigrants, generally fear that the country is moving apart, that it's moving beyond you. So inculcating the idea of fear by using a loaded term like civil war, I don't think is doing any good to try to, because if we, in the world where we want liberals and conservatives to get along, using hyperbolic language like civil war is not really going to do that. It's not conducive.
Well, but you just did it when you described what you believed a conservative was. I mean, you were like, here's my definition of what conservatives are. You just did the exact thing you said that you didn't want done with civil war. And
the difference is I can back up that statement.
I respect your opinion, but you to do the generalizations that you just did about all conservatives, congratulations, you just made my argument. Thank you.
No, I said that there's an association with conservatism and an increased fear response in psychology. Now, this doesn't mean all conservatives are fearful, but more likely, if a person's politics is defined by fear, they're going to move more towards the conservative end of the spectrum. I can bring you hundreds of peer-reviewed papers in psychology about this. This is a
wonderful, but I think I feel as a conservative, what you just did was label me, apply your definitions to it, which is what you were just arguing we were doing with civil war. You just did with conservatism, and you did it very fluently. I'm not arguing whether you're right or wrong, but I'm saying I don't feel that way, and I've been a conservative for many years. So to me, I feel like, well, wait a minute. You're making generalizations based on psychological papers. I actually talked to real conservatives, and they're not feeling some of the ways that you've described. So what So
And
I'm dealing with abnormalities only. This focus on trying to come up with definitions, labels, and trying to drill in on those things and focusing on those things actually adds to some of the discourse that's out there, in my opinion.
and furthermore, just taking, I mean, just to, again, this is, I'm not arguing with your whatever the papers you're reading are saying. I'm sure there is, again, talking about framing, and I have a degree in psychology, so I know all too well how surveys and things can be, worded and framed, and all the things we were just talking about that I would say, again, is harder to identify in writing and in text than it is in someone speaking to you. But the point of just having this blanket statement is who when it comes to conservatives versus liberals, who would you say over the past year in general who has exhibited a higher level of fear in general?
Fear in general, I mean, I would probably say conservatives.
So the whole, remember, we're on YouTube, so let's try to not, I don't care about cursing, but let's try to use non-banned words with the sickness. And that's where I'm going with this, is that clearly it's not the Conservative Party that is fearful about this.
Yeah, but they are very fearful of government takeovers, of jab mandates.
Okay.
They're very fearful of
okay. So let's parse
increased crime.
I said, hold on. So let's parse. Again, breaking it down to semantics, is the fear that you're going to die from something the same thing of the fear of losing a value that you hold dear, that is being openly attacked? Is that the same type of fear?
I'm not sure. Fear is a very irrational emotion, so people have like different things. I used to have a phobia of cockroaches. I was more afraid of cockroaches than of heights, even though one could kill me and the other one couldn't.
So I'm asking for your judgment right now in the moment. Even if you haven't thought about it before, you're a smart guy. You can take these two situations and you can say, oh, these are the same or these are not the same. So the fear that you are going to die from a sickness that has a 99.9% survival rate, is that the same type of fear as, oh no, these values that I like are being attacked, and I don't like that?
They're probably
I would
not
say
the same
fear
type of
is fear.
Oh, well, I would say they're very different, but okay.
I mean,
it would be very difficult for me to compare fear because everyone experiences that differently.
Well, right,
But
and that's why that's precisely why your blanket statement that conservatives come from fear may be justified in the way that this study presents it, but in just layman speaking, to suggest that fear is a driver for people to congregate in a certain ideology across the whole nation, I don't really see that as like, okay, yeah, the right's the fearful side and the left is the strong and brave side.
No, the left is not brave. If I were to say what drives
We
the
agree.
left, what drives the left, unfortunately, I don't know necessarily if this is true of like mainstream liberalism, but a lot of, especially people on the far left, the socialists, the communists, they're driven by a politics of envy. That's generally the negative trait that drives a person's politics. And I think having politics defined by either fear or envy is both very harmful to society. I mean, I don't like the communists. They're very harmful and they're very stupid. But generally speaking,
I'm going to side with you on that one.
Yeah. So generally, it's the issue is for a lot of people when they enter politics, they enter it in very emotionally, and they process a lot of these changes emotionally. It's just for different people, the emotions that they process things is different. I'll go replace this camera battery.
All right.
I'm sorry.
And, yeah, and again, I agree with you, but Blaine, I'm interested because I assumed that you might agree that saying that conservatives are the fearful party, even giving him a chance to explain that's not necessarily what he meant. That that's kind of I mean, bombastic is a strong word, but it is kind of a pretty bombastic thing to say. That just,
I think that there are different fears for different political entities, period, across the board. To say one is more fearful than the other, that's why I said fear is fear, because if you try to figure out who's more afraid? How do you quantify that and measure it? And how do I say that your fear is not as valid as someone
Right.
else's fear, and
And
things along those lines? We could spend all day arguing about that, and then we get back into definitions
So
and
I just want to make the one clear statement. The statement is not that conservatives are more fearful than liberals. It's that the primary emotions that dominate a conservative's engagement in politics is fear, and the primary emotion that engages drives engagement in politics for a lot of people on the far left is envy. That doesn't mean
is
that
what?
the person is
Envy?
envy.
so how does that play out practically? Because I have not heard this before.
Okay, so for example, people are more motivated. I'm pretty sure you've heard the story about like a record number of people running for like conservatives running for school boards, right?
Yeah.
So one of the reasons why that they cite is that they're very worried. They'll say concerned, worried, fearful. They'll use all of the same words
Okay.
of what their children are learning in school, primarily in juxtaposition to CRT. Liberals are not worried about CRT. They would be fearful of certain things, but they're not thinking, "Oh my God, I want to fix." I'm like terrified of these conservatives have power. Their primary engagement in politics is generally like, "I am very outraged that something terrible has happened. Why is there so much suffering in this? Why are these people who are very downtrodden, these oppressed, suffering so much? How do I go about fixing it, or how do I make them feel better?" It's a different emotional response for a lot of people.
It's interesting you go down there because one of the things I respected about your resume was that you got been involved and engaged in politics. I assume you got involved and engaged in politics to guide direction and to make sure that you had a voice that reflected your ideals in government. Would that be a safe assessment?
Yeah.
So I would say the same thing is true of any parent who decides to get involved with their local school board or their local county politics. It's not out of fear. It's I want to
Right.
be there and have that same level of engagement you voiced is exactly what I think they're asking for. And so you've taken it and said, well, it's more based on their fear. Well, maybe yours is based on the fear that conservatives will win and they're not going to go down the road to the ideals you hold so dear. So, we can play this game back and forth, and I don't want to make this personal because it's not by any stretch. But you're ascribing an emotional reaction, which is fear, to the people who are running for the school board because for the first time ever, parents because kids were working at home and taking their classes from home, got exposure to what they were learning, and they're going, look, I want to have a voice in that. And it's not fear, it's I want to be there and make sure that what's happening is consistent with the values I believe to be true, just like you are when you're supporting candidates that you believe in. And I respect it. I don't necessarily I don't respect Bernie Sanders at all, but that doesn't mean I don't respect the fact that you respect him. You're an intelligent person, very clearly. You're articulate, which I'm very impressed with,
Thank you.
and you're well read. Um, that doesn't mean that my view of Bernie Sanders is any different. And it means that I need to be respectful of your view of Bernie Sanders. And that's okay.
I mean, I would disagree with you. I don't think you need to respect my view of Bernie Sanders. Whether or not you like the same people,
I
that
agree
like
with you,
is
but he will anyway.
relevant.
And that is a cultural thing that I think is a good metric. You're absolutely right. He has no obligation to respect your choices, your opinions, any of that. But he will anyway, because that's a value that is consistent with a lot. Certainly not all. Certainly not all. There's assholes all over. We don't have to use that disclaimer every time, but it's way more characteristic of the left to choose not to respect the opinions of others versus the conservative mindset. Would you agree?
I would agree with that. I believe that everyone should have the right to express their opinion. By no means should all opinions be respected. I don't agree with that statement.
I like that. That's a good
Yeah,
line.
no. So
Can I use that, by the way?
Go ahead. I'll give you
Thanks.
all sorts of one-liners.
And so
No, it's a good one. I think I've just seen, I was talking with somebody not too long ago, and we were talking about some of the attacks I've faced from progressives, etc., to the point where someone threatened my life, and I had to get a restraining order against them because they had gone off the rails. And they made an interesting point. They said we don't hear about this with conservatives doing it to the left. And I said, no, you got to back off that. It does happen. There are threats that are made every time somebody comes out. There's crazies out there on both sides that do this.
Absolutely.
But I said, it's much more of a public lynching on one side than the other. But I've seen plenty of liberals get roasted by conservatives. Right,
But
wrong,
the
or indifferent. And so I think a lot of that conflict that we talked about is happening out there. I don't think it's healthy for any of us at this point. I agree
certainly
with
not.
you. Let everybody just say what they've got to say. If you don't like it, well, then you move on to the next thing. It's you have a fundamental freedom in this country. I feel it's not in the Constitution, so I know you're going to hit me with that. It's okay if you're offended. It's okay if you're upset by what somebody says. There's nothing that protects you from being unoffended.
Yeah.
I don't
That
disagree with
that's
that.
Yeah.
yeah.
And the at the end of the day, it's of course we could just brush off and brush off the labels and the semantics and can we all get along and this and that and I don't think anybody on this panel right now is the heart of the problem that we are discussing. But because politics works the way it does, then when you label yourself a certain way or you support a certain policy or a candidate, then you're now tied to that. And so that's where I think it becomes not important but helpful to have an agreed upon, at least within the confines of any given conversation, agreed upon terms and understanding what do we mean by war when we say war? Okay, well, let's say conflict, and then we all know what we're talking about with conflict. And to kind of clamp down on the actual issue that we were talking about, this idea of being able to express your ideas is one that seems like it should always be a foregone conclusion that if you have an opinion, it should be out there and so on, and that's the end of it. And that seems to be the mindset when it comes to the CRT stuff. And the personally with you, Anirudh, having spoken about it before, I feel that you have a inaccurate depiction of what it is that people have an issue with about the whole CRT thing. And just now that we have Blaine here, Blaine, I would if you I don't know how familiar you are with this issue, but I'd love to hear your thoughts.
You know, I struggle with the concept that race is the defining element of what a person is in our country. And I've never believed that. It's contrary to what I was raised with, and it's contrary to the values that I have. And I think it actually further divides our nation to use that as the cornerstone for marking, what where people come from and what their perspectives are. And I think it does actually more harm to us as a nation than good, personally. But that's my opinion of it. Having looked at some of the 1619 materials, I was like, as a historian, I got to be honest with you. I wasn't pleased at all with what I saw because it really pushed forward that division. And I think we've got plenty of divisions right now. We don't need anything else pushing that. Having said that, should race be taught? Should the civil rights movement be taught? Should slavery be talked about in schools? Absolutely,
As it has been for the last
as it has been for
90.
years. And but is that the thing that defines who you are in this nation? I thought we moved past that, personally, and and I find it just to be a struggle.
And I'd like to throw it to you as well, Anirudh. But before I do, the reason I asked Blaine first was again because we have had this conversation, and we were talking. I think the crux of that part of the conversation was that you were under the impression that conservatives were arguing that critical race theory itself was being taught in schools, and that just wasn't the case. And so, all of this hullabaloo is over nothing. Notice Blaine didn't even utter CRT, critical race, or, well, he said race, but he didn't say theory, and he certainly didn't say any of those things. And so I invite you to respond directly to Blaine, but I also would I would like to see if what he has said and what we're saying now kind of sheds a little bit more light on the point that I was trying to make, that it's not about whether it's the CRT, whether it qualifies as CRT or it's not technically CRT. It's whatever it is that's being taught is what people have the problem with.
All right, so I guess we'll do it this way. Look, Blaine, I agree with you. In an ideal world, race would be a non-issue. We wouldn't even talking about it, and it would be as superfluous as a person's eye color or hair color. Unfortunately, this is an issue that economist William Easterly has pointed out multiple times, which is oftentimes because we form ethnic communities, we create both incentive traps and incentive successes. One of the issues is that oftentimes the environment you grow up with is characterized by geospatial racism. Like I think the first thing that most people go to when they talk about like systemic racism is talk about police. That's not a good example. The best examples would probably be in geospatial segregation. There are cases to this day where even though the legal laws that separated red line neighborhoods, those are no longer on the books, the inequality that is created in the housing values has resegregated individuals to where there are some cities right now that are more segregated than they were in the 70s. And oftentimes that is just done due to the unforeseen circumstances of not addressing racial disparities. We've had racial disparities, but if we are all running a race and then one group of people had their legs blown out from under them and only got healed 2 months in, they're already far behind. And those inequalities, if not addressed, are going to fester and create more unhappiness, more civil strife. And talking about race and understanding these were the injustices that happened then. This is our failure to respond to them. And these are ways that we can move towards fixing that. I think at least gives children the correct paradigm to understand, all right, the world that they're inheriting is not, it's not hunky-dory. There are some issues that they've inherited from their parents and they're going to have to fix. Like, I don't know if you've would have talked about this, but one of the things that I learned because I was in Texas, so a lot of the history curriculums that I learned up until I got to the AP level in high school, they were very much focused on giving like an idealistic understanding of our state, of our country. And only afterwards did we start talking about things like the Tuskegee experiments, where we started talking about the enforcement of the model minority myth in the United States. Different experiences that are more telling of my experience as an immigrant to this country, and not something you would necessarily see in a type of history that's very whitewashed and tries to paint like America as like a intrinsically one way or another. I think a lot of people had the issue with the 1619 Project because they made the claim that, they made some incorrect historical claims. I'll agree with you on that. But they also made the claim that America was inherently racist. And I think that that statement is not incorrect because unfortunately, these two statements exist simultaneously, that America is a deeply racist country, but is also probably one of the least racist countries on the planet. And dealing with that is something that we're going to have to deal with. And try to
I don't disagree that there are race issues that have to be addressed, but I'm the only person on this call that was alive during the civil rights movement, albeit I was a young child at the time. I
Yeah,
actually
but you're white, so we don't want to hear from you. No, I'm just
Well,
kidding.
no, my opinion's just as valid as anyone else's. And
Absolutely.
having watched where we at, I think we're at a better state now in terms of race than up until I'd say the last year or so than we have ever been as a nation.